Welcome, everybody. I assume you're here for the Flatcar Linux talk. So, let's first start by doing a showing of hands. How many people know what container Linux is from CoreOS? Okay, that wasn't not everybody's hand. Okay, and how many people have heard of Flatcar Linux? Okay, good. There's less hands. So that means this is going to be a very informative talk, even on the technology side of it. But we're also going to talk about other aspects of this. Okay, my name is Chris. I am CEO at Kinfolk. How many people have actually heard of Kinfolk? Okay, that's very few. This is a very good opportunity for me to introduce us. Yeah, so we're a small company based out of Berlin. We focus on the core of the system, the things like the container runtimes, the kernel, the lower level of Kubernetes, process management. So, you know, things, to name a few projects, Kubernetes, Rocket we worked on for a long time, systemd, we have people who do systemd development, and we do kernel things when we have to. And so we focus on this, we call ourselves deep stack Kubernetes experts. And so it says here engineering services and products. Up until this point, we've pretty much only done services. Flatcar is our first venture into products, but as we do everything open source, you could probably just as well say projects. So before we dive into this talk, I do want to do a little plug for a conference that we have in Berlin at the end of September. This is a conference for these core Linux technologies, the things above the kernel and below the app. And it's not particularly to cloud space, it's not particularly for the embedded space, it's not particularly for the desktop space, it's basically for all Linux technologies, because even if you work with containers in the cloud space, this is the same kind of technology that systemd will use on embedded devices, or that something like Flatpak will use on the desktop. And so this is a conference really for those core technologies and not a specific area where they're applied. And we have some very nice sponsors here, and Amazon actually joined yesterday, which we haven't got them on here yet. So the plan for this talk is to answer these questions. What is Flatcar Linux? Why fork CoreOS's container Linux? Okay, why should Kinfolk do this? And the current status of the project, and the future plans that we have. So the first step is to cover what is Flatcar Linux, and if you do want information about this later on, you can go to flatcar-linux.org. By the way, how many people know what a Flatcar is? Okay, maybe, okay. So Flatcar is the rail car that is flat, and you can put things on top of it, including containers. So we're kind of taking the container analogy away from the ships and putting them on trains. So when we talk about what is Flatcar Linux, the easy answer is to say it's a fork of CoreOS's container Linux. But as not everybody raised their hand about what container Linux is, I think this is the point where we have to realize that many of us in the container space are in kind of a bubble. And I realized this personally when we were at KubeCon, and we told people asked us what is Flatcar Linux. We said it's a fork of container Linux. And then they're like, what is container Linux? And we're like, okay, you know the CoreOS, they had an operating system. They're like, no. So let's revisit really shortly actually what this means and what this is from a technology point of view. So we're going to move away from this, and we're going to talk about these more specific details. So it's a Linux OS for container workloads, so it's specifically for containers. And some of the next points will make this very clear how this works. It's a derivative of Chromium OS. How many people know Chromebooks from Google? All right, so they share a lineage. Chromium OS is the base, the open source project that Chromebooks are built on top of. It basically shares this build system, the SDK, and it also shares the fact that Chromium OS is based on Gentoo packages. And so basically there's kind of a line here now from Flatcar, Container Linux, Chromium OS, Gentoo. So there's a bunch of Linux love happening there. It's also minimal. When we say that it's a container, it runs container workloads, this means your containers bring in the dependencies that they need. And so the operating system itself is super minimum. You only have things there that will allow you to run containers. And so the operating system itself can be immutable. So the image that you actually start your operating system with, it can't be changed. There's no package manager to add packages because all your dependencies are living inside of the containers. And one of the most revolutionary parts of this is the automated updates. So if we aren't treating our systems as pets, in other words, tending to them particularly, then there has to be a way to then they can just go away, and then they can come back up, and preferably with new updated software. And this is the way this works. So in Container Linux, with Flatcar Linux, what you have is an A and a B system partition. And so it is running out of one of those, the current system, and every, I think, 45 minutes, it pings an update server. When there's an update available, it'll pull that down, verify that it has the right keys, or it's validated with keys, and then it will reboot the system. Depending, you can have actually different. You can actually turn this mechanism off if you want to, and there's also different mechanisms. You can do everything at once. You can do rolling, but basically it'll restart into the new system, and if that goes successfully, it'll just run. If it doesn't, it'll fall back to the other one and reboot. And it's designing for running at scale. You don't really run these on a single machine unless you're somebody crazy. I think Jessie Frizzell, she runs Container Linux on her desktop using a bunch of containers. That's kind of crazy. Normal people don't do that. It's made to support many machines in a cluster. And it also has different channels for delivery. The new things come into alpha. Hopefully they get tested a bit. They mature into beta. And then you have the stable, which you're probably running in production. But it is always recommended that when you're running a stable cluster, you want to put in a couple of betas machines in there, because you want to detect if there's anything happening, give feedback to us, to the upstream Container Linux projects, so that stable will really be stable. And this actually bit somebody not too long ago. There was a Medium post about it. So what happened is Chorus had this system called Fleet before Kubernetes came out, and people were still using that, but they announced a year before that they were going to discontinue it. They were going to remove it from their image. But this company didn't really get that, or they didn't get the notices, and they weren't testing their betas. And so when the new update came, it came into their system. It didn't have this core thing that they were using to orchestrate their containers, and of course their system broke. So it's always good to use beta. Breaking changes should not happen, but if they do happen, they will probably be broadcast a year in advance. And if you're testing your beta, you'll be ready for it. So then the next question was, why fork Container Linux? Actually, there's one point that I want to get to before that's not actually on this slide. And I think everybody knows CoreOS was acquired by Red Hat. And so for us, that actually prompted that, but as we'll talk about later, that was not the only reason that happened. So first of all, it was a great idea. You have to think, containers are happening. This is happening in 2013, I think it first started. You have to think Google is doing some stuff, the Borg stuff. The Chromium OS is there. It has an interesting update mechanism. And then there's also the browser updates that are happening. A few years back, if you remember, there was this conversation around updating browsers. And Linux distros were kind of against this because they were always managing the updates. And they were pushing back on that. But eventually, the browser vendors prevailed. And I think we found that actually was very beneficial. First of all, you get security updates really fast, faster than the distributions can apply them. And it really pushed web standards forward. And so this is what kind of is happening in the container space with Container Linux and now Flatcar. So it was a great idea. And so a big shout out to the original Core S team, Alex, Brendan, Michael Marino, who doesn't get much credit, but he was in I think, one of the first 3 there. They did really great work. And so it was a great idea, and it remains a great idea. It works. People actually use it. That's always the first measure. And if we want to have a measure how much it works, I would say about, I think Red Hat put a price on that. So we kind of show that this system works. And it's widely used. Almost any tutorials you follow, any tools you use, there's always going to be a showing of how that works with container Linux. And so this thing is hugely popular. It kind of goes one-in-one with the container ecosystem itself. Another reason we forked it is because we kind of had to. And this goes back to the first thing about how this started with the Red Hat acquisition. People were contacting us in summer of last year, and they were saying, hey, CoreOS is not actually offering support for the OS anymore. They're only offering support for it when you get the Tectonic stack. So they were kind of moving away from focusing, offering this for support for the OS, and they were only offering it for the full Tectonic Kubernetes stack that they were offering. And so some people who only really wanted the OS, they were looking for help. And so I didn't mention earlier, but we did work on Rocket for a long time. We were kind of associated pretty closely with the CoreOS team because we worked so closely with them. And so some people were coming to us to ask these questions. And so for us, it was, yeah, we could offer support, but an operating system is very different than just any project on GitHub. You don't just put the little corner of your website and say, fork me on GitHub. There's build infrastructure you have to set up. There's security policies you have to do. You have to manage the keys for assigning images, for signing update images. You have to manage the infrastructure for doing the update server. You actually have to have an update server. So there's a lot of going on there. And so we had to if we wanted to provide support. And this is why I say the acquisition prompted us to do it quickly, but we were already talking about and planning on doing this eventually. But we were trying to figure out how, because we didn't really want to compete with CoreOS, because our whole company is about collaboration rather than competition, which is strange, being a for-profit company. But that's kind of how we want to work. And so this opportunity came up, and it was like, okay, that makes it obvious. There are tons of people asking what's going to happen to container Linux. We had an answer for that, and so yeah, we were happy that the opportunity came up so clearly for us. And then we have the philosophy that all great open source projects, which we think container Linux is they should have multiple backing places where you can get backed. This is harder in the OS space for all the reasons I mentioned, but you find this in a lot of other projects. The Linux kernel, you can go to many, many companies to get support for it. Kubernetes, the same. And so we're happy. Actually, one of the reasons, I'll get to that later because I actually have a slide about it, but yeah. And this comes into why Kinfolk. So there was not that many hands that got raised when you were saying, who is Kinfolk? So I think this might give you a bit more of context. So this really fits our technical interest and skills. One of the ways I quickly introduce ourselves is that we're the Linux geeks of the cloud native space. So kind of having a distro is kind of the ultimate in that. So we're really happy to have, it's kind of a platform where we can try things out, not on the production stable ones, but now we actually control the build system for an operating system. We can create separate channels for doing experimental things. That's kind of cool. And it fits our mission. So this is when I come to the hardest part of this talk. So the mission, we're here to basically improve, build upon, and promote foundational open source cloud native technologies. I think we've done this and we've been very successful with it. We're about 3 years old now. And we've done projects on kernel, systemd, containers, Kubernetes, and 90% of our work has been completely open source, which we're pretty proud of. And we can only do that because we have really cool clients who expect that from us. By the way, yeah, we're not a startup. We're not funded by anything. We don't have products. We offer services. And it fits our vision because we want to be the independent community partner with technical expertise in these open source cloud native infrastructure technologies. That's a mouthful. But basically what we see when you're depending on open source, there's a few factors here. Sometimes you have no idea where to go to because a project was started by, let's say Google, for example, and you don't go to Google to get services, especially if you're a medium-sized company, maybe if you're a huge company. And so where do you go to get that expertise? So we're trying to fill that space for a very popular, very instrumental, low-level tools. And it allows us to be more involved in upstream projects. And so what we've done now, we've been pretty effective in this, but we're offering commercial support for Flatcar, and what we see is that's going to provide us with a means to, of course, make Flatcar and Container Linux itself better, but it's also going to give us the opportunity to work on these projects that are actually a part of the, to make bug fixes, improve those. It's going to give us the financial means to actually put resources on that. Like I said, we're not a startup. We actually have absolutely no exit strategy, except maybe retirement. So we really like what we do. We feel like this mission that we have is kind of unique in the space. I think if you talk to many of the clients and others who know us, we don't really compete with any of them. We complement. And this is really what we find is really cool about what we do and exactly what we want to continue doing for the long term. And so, and I think this is what I was going back to with the having multiple supporters of really popular open source projects. If they're kind of run by only a startup, then you have questions like what happens when there is an acquisition. This is not a difficult question if you're, if it's just a project that you can fork on GitHub. But if you're for an operating system, it is a bigger question, like who's going to actually take over that maintenance and the managing the infrastructure. So now let's get to the current status. So we're actually really happy with, so basically Container Linux is a one-to-one completely compatible version of, Flatcar Linux is completely compatible with Container Linux, sorry. It's basically, if you look at the package versions between the two operating systems, the diff will say these files are exactly the same. And we want to keep it that way. So what we're doing right now is that we have a set of patches for the trademark stuff. We can't use the CoreOS and Container Linux name. So we have a patch for trademarks. This is very similar to Red Hat Enterprise Linux and CentOS. And we, as soon as we see the tag go in GitHub for the Container Linux repository, we set off our builds. We do this merge, and we set off our builds. Occasionally, our builds are finished before they are, and we actually publish before them. This is not something we're trying to do, but it just happens sometimes. And so we're very happy with the way this build infrastructure works. And we've done about 20 releases, I think, so far, and across the channels. We also, right now, what we're not really happy about with the current status is so we set up the build infrastructure. We can do the builds, but we haven't really put that many resources into the maintenance. This is has two reasons for it. We kind of know that the Red Hat and CoreOS people probably have like tectonic contracts that are good for a year or something, so they have to maintain it for a while. So we're using this time to kind of set up certain things that we know are going to be important in the future and focusing on that. And so we're relying mostly on the CoreOS and Red Hat teams to actually do the maintenance. That is something we're going to be changing pretty soon. And so a big shout out to the CoreOS, a second shout out to the CoreOS and the Red Hat team, because we're very reliant on them right now. One thing we have done is we've made sure that we're trying to make sure we can get support in the, like I said, the tutorials are supporting Container Linux. These different projects are supporting Container Linux. What we're trying to do is get Flatcar Linux support into that. So a project, how many people have heard of Project Typhoon? Okay, very few, so I can be the first to tell you. Typhoon is basically a free open source Kubernetes distro. It's actually, this is basically a fork of Tectonic CoreOS, the Tectonic Kubernetes stack from CoreOS. And it was actually forked from a previous employee who is now at Lyft. His name is Dalton Hubble. And he was on the Tectonic installer team at CoreOS. And it's very nice. It basically has a lot of the same characteristics as Tectonic, except for the auto-updating part. So we're very happy to have Flatcar supporting this. So you can run this today on bare metal or AWS, and all you have to do is choose a variable to run Flatcar on it. And right now we're working to get this into support into Azure, GCE, and DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean is very soon, and the others should be coming in the next months. Right now we're only really offering support for larger installations. This is because we're a small team and we're building up the infrastructure, the ticketing system for support and things like that. That'll probably take a few months. But we're happy to. We have a lot of experience supporting companies with their core technologies, and so if we have larger contracts, we can have a few that we actually focus on for this time. So let's talk a little bit about the future plans. One of the things we're looking to do is to build up a dedicated team around Flatcar. This is the plug, we're hiring. So if you like these kind of things, we're interested to talk to you, especially if you come with Linux skills and you're interested in the cloud native space, that's exactly perfect for us. But yeah, back to the talk. We want to start contributing more significantly to maintenance. This is something right now that like I said, we're not really doing too much of. We got everything set up. We're focusing on some other things, some managerial, I guess, things, some infrastructure things for us, as far as accepting issues and things like that. But what we want to do eventually is to put more effort on the maintenance side of things. We want to roll out general support plans. And so this is so we can support smaller installations. But we're the tortoise. Like I said, we're not a startup. We didn't have $8 million in the bank at one time and to build up a team very quickly. We're doing this deliberately, carefully, and making sure we do it right. So we look, as far as the timeline, we're looking at this like, end of the year kind of thing. But we know we have this kind of runway because we kind of can calculate that there are existing support contracts right now for Container Linux. One of the cool things we want to do is offer custom and experimental images. One of the ideas we had, how many people went to Albin's talk in the ship right before this? Okay, yeah, so he's my colleague, and we kind of have this idea that there's some, he highlighted some kernel changes that would need to be made and maybe some other tools. Now we kind of have our own OS. It would be cool to have a channel that's specifically made to build unprivileged container images. That would be kind of cool. And so these kind of ideas are things that we might do in the future if we have some capacity to work on them. You can imagine other things. For example, there could be a more minimal image. If we're talking about custom images, somebody might come to us and say, hey, we don't really want to do the automated updates. Can we remove the things that are required for that? And we're happy to do that, of course. And one of the things we're going to be offering near the end of the year as we roll out support plans, we mentioned Typhoon. We are actually looking to offer not only support for the OS, but also core Kubernetes support. Now, this is not going to be necessarily and fully, it's not going to be OpenShift or even Tectonic. It's going to be more geared towards companies who are setting up their own and want to make their own Kubernetes offering, but they want somebody to really tend to the core of things. This is kind of what we're looking at. And we want to work on raising awareness. I guess that's what I'm doing here. More people know about it. I want to continue doing that. So that's actually the talk. I have time for questions. I think about 8 more minutes if you have questions for me. And oops, I went the wrong way. So we're hiring, but I'll say thank you. Thanks. So questions? You get an orange square if you ask a question.
So isn't used core OS not more or less to be feature complete? So what is, in terms of technical development, Flatcar aiming for?
Well, I think actually on our FAQ it actually says basically we find that Container Linux does pretty much everything it should do. It should be minimal. I don't think we're going to add a lot of features. The features you're going to get are from the components inside of it, whether it's from the Linux kernel. Obviously, there's CVs come out. We need patches, those kind of things. I think those are probably the most important features for users of Container Linux and Flatcar. You get new. I don't think there's going to be any new features inside of Flatcar itself. Some ideas though we have are, okay, let's actually make this easier for people to build their own operating systems. So that might be a feature that, from the more infrastructure side, not really from the actual OS itself. I don't know, did you have any ideas for Container Linux that you would like to, or Flatcar that you would like to have?
I haven't thought about this.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think for most people, the features go into the containers. There's obviously a lot of work. This happens all the time on the kernel level, but yeah, I don't think new features is not something we're focused on. It's more maintaining a stable and continuing this because when the acquisition happened, a lot of people were asking what's happening, and Red Hat has announced they're going to have their Red Hat Core OS, I think is what they're calling it, and this is kind of a similar thing but based on RPM packages. So I'm not exactly sure how that's going to go, but for us, Flatcar Linux is a drop-in replacement for a Container Linux, and we plan on maintaining that further. So it's basically a continuation, and that's what we're trying to offer. Next, questions? You have a question over there? Can you throw it? It's a catch box.
Thanks. So we had an issue some days ago with the .5 release of Container Linux, where single nodes did not come up after automated update. So I'm wondering, is there a mechanism to schedule this and test this a little bit better? I haven't looked that much into the auto update, but it came very surprising early.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the first part. You had an issue with the auto update. Was it a particular feature that rolled into it, or a lack of feature? Or?
We haven't really found out what the cause of the problem was. But like after the reboot, the node did not came up properly. There was something with the IP tables locking. I'm not sure if this is directly related or not. But like how to prevent this in the future? Like how to stage and test this better?
So there's actually a very large test suite for Container Linux. And when I say Flatcar and Container Linux often interchangeably, because literally the point is to be almost the same. But yeah, there's a large test suite, and when something like this happens, usually a test is added. So that's the way to prevent that. You can actually view these test suite. It's open source. That's how we can use it. That's part of our merge cycle, is to pull in the new test. But yeah, actually recently, like I think in the last 2 weeks, there was 3 updates because they ran into this problem. So it should be fixed, I think. There was actually two updates really close together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, this is Yeah, and I guess this is one reason why you should be running, a beta. Maybe it'll help detect that.
Yeah, I made a note of that, thanks.
Okay, good. Any other questions? We got a.
So what I understood from your talk is right now you're rebuilding CoreOS as it is being put upstream from CoreOS, but it seems that Red Hat is intending not to exactly scrap the current stack, but more like rebuilding its own image based on Red Hat Enterprise Kernel and so on and so on. So at that point, what's the plan for you? Are you still going to do the build from upstream, or are you going to diverge?
Well, the thing is that from our conversations with the people at Red Hat, which are mainly former CoreOS people, they have said that for the foreseeable future that they will maintain container Linux as it is. That means with the Chromium OS and Gentoo sources. But they also have this Red Hat CoreOS, which is a slightly different thing, and there's a few extra things, features that they're putting in there. And so as long as we can, the way we do our changes, we don't do our changes on Flatcar Linux. We do our changes on the upstream. This is why when I say we have a friendly fork, this is one of the things I mean. Not only do we know a lot of the people who work on actually the upstream container Linux, we actually want to do our changes in container Linux upstream and then pull them in. So as long as that can happen, as long as there's enough resources for Red Hat to be responsive, if we have the support contracts and we have people come to us and they say, okay, there's a CVE that we have to address, we, of course, need a certain response time before it gets untenable for us, and then we would have to fork. But I don't see that happening anytime soon. If it does happen, it just happens, and that's okay. That's one of the reasons why Flatcar Linux exists. Any more questions? Okay, thank you for your time.